It had been around a week or so. Ben had gotten used to the dynamic of no one knowing who he is, and just doing what he could to help. Though he'd been annoyed by Captain Nemesis, who had appeared on scene recently. The guy was a glory-hogging jerk. He was really glad Grandpa Max and Gwen kept him from letting all this go to his head. Hearing screaming while walking around in town, Ben went to find out what was going on. As he'd seen, there was a fire burning in an apartment building. He looked around and saw that Captain Nemesis was doing an interview with a news guy, and got annoyed by that. Hitting the Omnitrix, he changed into Accelerate and ran to the building, grabbing everyone, and once the civilians were safe, he'd ran over to Nemesis, smacking him in the back of the head, knocking him over, stating, "Hey loser, you're supposed to save the people first, then do the interview. People's lives were at stake, you self-centered," and then began to go off on a rant using alien language he'd learned as a part of his plumber training before then running off. The jerk reporter had the gall to call Accelerate a glory hog, even though he'd just saved everyone, annoying Ben more as he'd heard them, and ran over, giving the man an atomic wedgie and somehow hanging him from a tree by his underwear. Accelerate ran to Max's rust bucket and went inside before timing out, as he'd heard Gwen and Charmcaster were laughing at the scene as the silver-haired girl says to him, "Nice one there," with Gwen agreeing, and Max was laughing a bit too, but told Ben he shouldn't do that, though Ben reminds him he's still a kid and it's okay for him to do it. You expect immaturity from a 10-year-old. Gwen then laughs more and says that, he's got you there, Grandpa. Ben then asks them what's on the agenda for today, as they are told by Charmcaster that Gwen is ready for the bestowal challenge, and if she passed, then she'd be ready for the next level in her study of the mystic arts. Exciting Gwen as she'd heard that, and said that she was absolutely ready. Nodding, Charmcaster says that they'll see, and began to lead Gwen away to a private location that they wouldn't be bothered. Ben was going to follow, but Max says he'd like Ben to stay and practice with some plumber tech he hasn't learned about before, explaining to him that he needs a way to fight without the Omnitrix for times when it times out and they're waiting for it to recharge. Ben agrees to this and sees different things that Max had laid out. He checked out a couple of the different stuff, but something felt right with two of the items in particular. One that had a ring on one end that, when grabbed fully by the handle and squeezed, made it protrude a plasma blade. The second, a small tube with a button on the top that, when pressed, made the tube extend outward into a staff. Max begins to teach Ben about how to use these weapons in particular, while Gwen is being tested by Charmcaster. And though he's trying to learn more about combat without the watch, he knew it would be just if he didn't have the watch working, though soon on the television and radio there were newscasts about Captain Nemesis calling out the monster that had saved everyone from the fire earlier. Ben apologizes and says that he needs to go now, but that he'd like Max to come along in case he needed backup. However, Max tells him he wouldn't need it, as good as he's been getting over the summer and even now. Ben then says, still, would feel better about the situation if you were there, even if only for support, to which Max nods and they go off to deal with this jerkwad. We see that Nemesis was calling out for those monsters to fight him, being enraged about having been shown up by them one time too many. And Ben then activates the dial on his watch before slapping it down, changing into something new. They were a tall humanoid alien with F plugs for fingertips and M plugs at the tips of their two antennae and tail. He also had one green eye and the Omnitrix symbol on his chest. Ben looks at himself and says, "Cool, a new transformation. Let's see what this can do," as he goes to face off against Nemesis, who calls out, saying, "Oh great, another new monster to deal with," to which Ben responds, "Monster? I'm an alien, pal. You want to see a monster? Try a mirror," making Nemesis even angrier as he then fired a blast of energy at Ben, though with the new form he was able to absorb it. The new form Ben acquired looked surprised, but then smirked, calling out for Nemesis to give him all he's got, as the fake hero then proceeds to do so, firing off blast after blast after blast of energy, draining the power suit they had in the process. And Ben then begins to charge up an attack of his own, saying how cool this was, and fired a blast at Nemesis, sending him flying backwards and breaking the armor he was wearing in the process. Ben then calls out to the cops that they can come out now now to arrest them, and they then go to do just that, now that it was safe anyway. One of the officers questioned what his name was, and Ben thinks for a moment and says, "Feedback," before apologizing and saying that he needed to go and hit the Omnitrix symbol, changing to accelerate and running off. After Ben and Max returned to the rust bucket, they went back to Ben training without the watch, as he'd looked at the dial seeing it still in the red, but he didn't mind. Still, the new one felt different, but he was more focused on his training instead though. We later on get Gwen and Charmcaster both coming back and looking a bit worse for wear, but not too beat up. Ben questions what exactly happened to the two of them, and Charmcaster says she passed, in response to Ben's question. The silver-haired girl then says she'll need to get things ready before she leaves, as she needs to take care of some stuff, with Max nodding, listening to the conversation, and telling them that Ben was working on learning to fight without the Omnitrix. Gwen says that's cool, as Charmcaster then used her magic to make the two of them look as though they hadn't just spent all afternoon in battle, as a part of Gwen's training in the mystic arts. Then relaxed as Ben questioned when exactly Charmcaster's birthday was supposed to be, and she says that it's about 3 days from now, which means 3 days to make sure Gwen has everything for the next part of her training. The group nods listening to that, as Ben's mom calls Max to have him send Ben on home, because it was about time to have supper, and she wanted him home and cleaned up before that. So he relayed the message, and Ben proceeded to head on off back home, and back to his mom's health food. It's a wonder he'd even made it this long, though he wasn't about to tell her that because he didn't want to hurt his mother's feelings. Charmcaster tells Gwen she should also head on home, and with a nod she proceeds to start to head off back to her house, with Charmcaster sighing softly, and began prepping her bag and stuff, getting ready for when she could go off on her own again, as she was also supposed to be taking care of her own training as well. The final scene we get for this episode was the shadow of someone in a hooded outfit being cast over the "Welcome to Bellwood" sign.